This is the Mondo Weiss Podcast. I'm Dave Reed. The Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem encompasses several key sites central to Islam, including the Dome of the Rock, the third holiest site for Muslims, where the Prophet Mohammed is believed to have ascended to heaven, where he spoke to God. The compound sits on the Temple Mount, where the ancient Hebrew temple once stood. Today we have a conversation with our Palestine News team about the events surrounding Al-Aqsa during Ramadan this year. As readers of our site and listeners to this podcast are surely aware, the Israeli government carried out several raids of the Al-Aqsa compound in the last few weeks, leaving one Palestinian dead and hundreds injured and arrested. The Zionist propaganda machine has been working overtime to paint Palestinians as poor caretakers of these sacred spaces, claiming that children playing soccer or the very presence of fireworks prove that they don't deserve to be there in the first place. Yumna Patel, our Palestine News Director, leads the discussion with Mariam Barghouti in the West Bank, Tareq Hajjaj in Gaza, and myself.
Over the last week, it has been tumultuous, to say the least, in Palestine. And the ripple effects of Israeli violence on the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound last week have been felt everywhere, not just in Jerusalem, but also, as we've seen, in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in 48, and across Palestine and even the diaspora. What we do know and what we have been reporting on as well is the fact we report on all the time is that nothing happens in a vacuum. And so I want to break down a little bit of the context surrounding last week's events at the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Israeli police's raids into the mosque compound, during which they beat up worshippers. So, Mariam, I want to go to you and ask you, could you give us some of the general context of the days and perhaps weeks leading up to Israel's raids on the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, and even things that were happening on the same day just around those raids that will help people sort of understand the situation in which those occurred and which those took place?
Developments here, the violence does not happen in a vacuum. And if anything, it has been repeating across the decades. In Palestine, more recently in the West Bank, we have seen an escalation of Israeli violence through large-scale military assault that was dubbed Operation Break the Wave, launched last year. In the moments leading up to another incursion on Al-Aqsa last week was that we saw Itamar Ben-Gvir, the right-wing policymaker and Israel's Minister of National Security, promise incursions and invasions on Al-Aqsa. And now the last week's violence came in the context of Palestinian, Israeli, American, Jordanian, and Egyptian security heads meeting in Jordan in February and in Egypt on March 19th to further solidify collaboration between Israel's security system and the Palestinian Authority. And one of the promises within those meetings was that Israel would halt settlements. And what we have seen instead is not only are outposts being legalized again, but there is a continued push to attack Palestinians, even at the level of worship, where Jewish supremacy is further enforced and Israeli presence is further pushed forward on Palestinian sites, including holy sites that aren't just for Palestinians, but Muslim worshippers worldwide.
Maybe you could clarify the exact timeline on this. But almost immediately before the Israeli police conducted their violent raids on the Al-Aqsa compound, a Palestinian citizen of Israel was killed by police right outside of the gates of the mosque. And this again was happening. So that was another sort of provocation, you could say, and that definitely increased the tensions of the situation on the ground. Israeli police claim he tried to reach for a weapon or tried to attack police officers who were stationed in the area, but eyewitnesses say that he was actually trying to step in to defend a Palestinian woman who was being harassed by Israeli forces by the gates of the mosque. So we had a Palestinian who was killed right outside the mosque, which, as we know, is the holiest the third holiest site in Islam. And at the same time, there were increasing calls by radical Israeli settler movements to conduct a Passover sacrifice on the grounds of the mosque, which was seen as an extremely provocative measure for Palestinians, of course. And so all of this was also happening at the same time. So in addition to what you said of this larger context of increased violence towards Palestinian communities, the rising of the ranks and the consolidation of power of hardline settlers within Israel's government, we were also feeling this very real sort of tension forming on the ground between the settler movement, many of whom have called for the destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque so that the third Jewish temple could be built on top of it, and increased violence on the ground in Jerusalem, around the mosque and inside the mosque. The raids that happened on April 5th, when Israeli forces went into the Qibli prayer hall in the Al-Aqsa Mosque and started beating worshippers, those videos went viral around the world. But that was not the first raid that happened during Ramadan. Since Ramadan began, Israeli forces have been conducting raids onto the compound and have been harassing Palestinians in the Old City in Jerusalem, preventing them access to public spaces like outside the Damascus Gate, beating and arresting people, conducting arbitrary stops and searches of young Palestinian men. And so all of this, these very real aggressions were happening on the ground in Jerusalem and inside Al-Aqsa as well, leading up to those raids.
I was revising kind of the reporting also on Al-Aqsa raids in terms of repetition, that if we look at images from 2021, images from 2022, 2015, 2018 inside Al-Aqsa Mosque, the similarities of the images and the footage coming out is so uncanny that we have seen this happen over and over again. And the lead up to killing a 26-year-old in the Old City, the most heavily surveilled area in Jerusalem, and yet somehow the cameras did not work, according to Israeli police reports, is also telling that this is not just an incident that is happening. This is an incident that will continuously happen with crimes being covered up for Palestinians.
I want to touch on what you just said, which is obviously we've seen these sort of events play out before to some degree, but the images and the raids and the things we were seeing out of Al-Aqsa were almost identical to the raids that have been continuously conducted by Israeli forces at the compound over the past several years, particularly in 2021. In 2021, as I'm sure lots of the listeners are familiar with, during Ramadan in that year, there were consistent Israeli police raids happening on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, inside the mosque, targeting worshippers, and increased violence by Israeli police within the walls of the Old City and also outside on Palestinian life in general in East Jerusalem. That around the same time is when Israel was stepping up its measures and its plan to forcibly evict and dispossess Palestinians in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem, which was just a few kilometers away from the Old City. And all of those things that were happening, and again, those images that we saw in 2021 were very similar to what we saw last week. And what happened in 2021 were the raids on Al-Aqsa, coupled with the fact that this was coinciding with what Israel claims to be its Independence Day and the provocative flag march in Jerusalem that happens every year with right-wing Israeli settlers, plus the images we were seeing come out of Sheikh Jarrah. In 2021, all of that sort of created the perfect storm. And then we had Palestinian groups outside of Gaza then come out and essentially give an ultimatum to Israel, saying that if you do not pull out of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, pull out of Sheikh Jarrah, and stop violating the rights of the Palestinians in those places, then we will respond and we will retaliate with rocket fire. And that is exactly what happened. And then, as we know, that turned into an 11-day Israeli war on the Gaza Strip that killed more than 260 Palestinians. And alongside all of this, we saw a wave of uprisings across Palestinian communities inside Israel, inside the Green Line or 48. And we saw Palestinians coming together from Gaza, from East Jerusalem, from 48 in the West Bank, rising up in these mass protests that were being suppressed by Israeli forces, and then also particularly for the Palestinian communities inside Israel, they were being targeted by violent Jewish mobs that were attacking Palestinian homes and communities and businesses, and essentially the first versions, at least in the past few years, of what we saw of Jewish mobs carrying out pogroms against Palestinians, which now we know is a near daily occurrence in places like Hawara in the West Bank. So all of this is to say that we sort of saw all of this play out, and as Mariam pointed out, almost frame by frame in the same exact way in 2021. And so I think Mariam and Tareq could agree with me that last week we very much were feeling like, okay, could this be shaping up to be another 2021, another war on Gaza, another wave of uprisings, what was later, what's since been known as the Unity Intifada or the Dignity Uprisings. And so that brings me to Tareq. Last week, Tareq, in the midst of all of this happening, rockets were fired outside of Gaza by Palestinian factions. Israel conducted some strikes towards what it claimed were military targets. And initially, it was just a few, but then we saw those strikes started to develop and Israel began bombarding parts of the Gaza Strip with airstrikes. You wrote a piece for the website last week talking about how Palestinians fear that war is near as Israel conducts attacks in Gaza during Ramadan yet again. And so I wanted to turn to you, Tareq, and just ask you, what was last week like for Palestinians in Gaza as you were coming under bombardment by Israeli airstrike, and you all in Gaza were seeing things play out on the ground in Jerusalem, almost eerily similarly to what happened in 2021. What were the feelings on the ground? What were people thinking?
During the night of Thursday, April 6th, the Israeli air forces and tanks bombed and shelled Gaza Strip all the night. The sort of missiles that is used on Gaza is concussive that drill and explode deep under the ground. The sites Israeli targeted that night were empty military locations affiliated to different resistance factions in Gaza and people's farm next to the borders with Israel. The airstrikes left huge craters in the ground at the targeted sites. Shrapnel had flown everywhere, damaging nearby homes and buildings and filling the entire area with grey dust, mud, and rubble. The airstrike on one site on the Tufah area in the eastern Gaza Strip caused partial damage to the Adura Pediatric Hospital in the same area, which was condemned by the health ministry in Gaza. The Palestinian resistance factions, on the other hand, responded to these airstrike and fired rocket toward Israel. This escalation was predicted weeks ago, actually, by Palestinians, as they believe that the Israeli violence against Palestinians increased every year at the holy month of Ramadan, as Israel puts the Palestinians under huge pressure and violating their freedom of worship and also the holy mosques and sites. Ramadan for Palestinians, as you know, is the holy month of the year, and it is for prayers and worship. We are lucky as Palestinians in Palestine to have one of the most sacred places on earth, which is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So every Palestinian cannot miss the chance of living the atmosphere of Ramadan and join the prayers. But unfortunately, they face detention, killing, and attacks by the Israeli forces and settlers, and they ruin everything in the mosque and flame their holy books. This happened on Wednesday, April 4, April 5, sorry, one day before attacking Gaza, and over 150 Palestinians arrested from Al-Aqsa. Rockets fired that day from Gaza to Israel as a response, as a normal response. It's worth mentioning, Yumna, that during the holy month of Ramadan, people usually spend their most time during the night praying at mosque, especially in the last 10 days, because one unknown night from them worth 1,000 months of worshipping. It's the night of destiny, according to the Holy Quran, or as in Arabic, Laylatul Qadr. Even resistance for Palestinians is blessing in these most holy 10 days. This escalation looks similar, as you mentioned, to 2021 scenario when Israel stormed Al-Aqsa and detained over 200 people in the night of 25 of Ramadan. Palestinian factions in Gaza responded by firing rockets, and that led to a war of 10 to 12 days on Gaza, leaving 200 people, 200 Palestinians dead, and hundreds of families turned homeless. The Palestinian resistance faction in Gaza cannot separate themselves and turn blind eye on the Israeli aggressive against Palestinians at Al-Aqsa. They hold responsibility of defend the holy mosque of Al-Aqsa and the Palestinians worshippers inside it. When Israeli highly escalate their aggressive against on Palestinians, Gaza resistance immediately declares emergency status and they fire some rockets. Last week, the Joint Room of the Palestinian armed faction released a statement calling the Israelis to stop pushing their internal crisis toward the Palestinians and stop their aggressive. The statement said that Gaza resistance is ready to defend the Palestinian people and their holy sites. We mentioned last month in our reporting about this statement in a story about Palestinians' fear that Netanyahu may escape his internal crisis by launching a war in Gaza. This violence against Al-Aqsa and the Palestinian worshippers will absolutely lead to Gaza resistance to react. So now Palestinians in Gaza are praying that the situation will not be escalated to a devastated war, despite the fact that they lived some nights from last week as exactly as any night of any previous war.
I'm wondering, Mariam, if you can talk about how Palestinians experience the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock, really the entire compound in Jerusalem. Videos and photos of Palestinians playing soccer or setting off fireworks have been shared online over the past week. And Zionists have used them to claim that Palestinians don't even really, quote unquote, respect the area. But I'm just wondering if you can talk about how Palestinians on a regular basis and then during Ramadan experience and live in that space.
I think that's a really important thing to discuss, especially for Palestinians. As Tariq was explaining, i'tikaf, the prayer throughout the night in the last 10 days of Ramadan is so important because also under Islamic tradition and belief, you don't exactly know when the night of Isra and Mi'raj is. So you do the entire 10 days in hopes that you meet that day. For Palestinians in the West Bank specifically, entry into Al-Aqsa Mosque is limited to only on Friday, and it's only open for women and men over a certain age. And that means Palestinians in the West Bank must all gather at a single checkpoint, that is Qalandia checkpoint, which is close near Ramallah. And that means anyone that wants to come from the south of the West Bank or the north of the West Bank, Nablus, Jenin, Hebron, must make a trip to Ramallah and then pass through this checkpoint where soldiers are yelling at them and they're being caged in through an alleyway, basically, of concrete and guided at gunpoint through a very narrow path, hoping to reach there. And these are mostly also elderly men. You need to remember that they have to be over a certain age, that are in the heat of the sun, early hours in the morning, so that they can go to Al-Aqsa for just a few hours afforded to them on a single day of the week, only for this 1 month of Ramadan. And once they're there, they're attacked by Israeli forces as they complete their prayers. So for them, the reports that I received were that Israeli forces invaded Al-Aqsa compound and the Qibali Mosque as people were giving their final prayer, the final bow in their prayer. And they began firing tear gas, stun grenades. They were manhandling worshippers. And for Palestinian youth, especially those from Jerusalem, they responded with fireworks. So I think the Israeli narrative of trying to say they don't respect the space forgets to mention that this is the very space that Israeli forces are invading with weapons, a holy place of worship that is meant to be protected and a sanctuary of refuge for anyone that, especially in areas of conflict. Spaces of worship are supposed to be protected. So that's important to keep into the context. And then last week, Israeli forces arrested close to 400 worshippers under the pretext that they were inflicting violence, but they were actually responding to an incursion by an armed force that is organized crime by the state. That these soldiers do not operate unless they get a green light and a command from senior operatives and policymakers. So for worshippers who are civilians, in essence, to be left to fend themselves against that, it's very telling of Israeli policies. They followed it with arresting them. 400 were arrested, and they were taken to cell number 4 in the German compound in Jerusalem, the main police station. And cell number 4 is known to be a cell of torture. So can you imagine being a worshipper and taken to cell number 4 because Israeli forces invaded, fired tear gas, stun grenades, beat up persons, had killed someone in the old city within that week as well, and yet you get arrested. Of those 47 Palestinians from the West Bank that were arrested, remember they had done the trip earlier in the day, then got beaten up as they were worshiping, and then got detained, imprisoned by Israel, and their prisons are notorious for mistreatment and abuses against Palestinians. And they were only released today. 47 Palestinians remained detained because they were worshiping God in a month that is considered holy within the belief of Islam. And they are also fined a monetary fine as punishment. So that's really what the experience is like in terms of what happened, but how Palestinians are made to feel, the violence they're exposed to, that becomes more difficult to capture, I think, in words.
And I guess what I was also trying to get at is these aren't spaces that are cloistered and held away from or held separate from people's lives. Palestinian Muslims live in and on and with these spaces on a daily basis. So yeah, during the holy month of Ramadan, there are kids that play soccer. I remember growing up as a Jewish kid here in the United States, there was a playground at my synagogue. We had a field. We played soccer. We played games inside the synagogue. When there were, holidays like Purim, we set off firecrackers outside. There were, small fireworks and stuff that we were setting off for different holidays and events. And this sort of line of argument that Palestinians don't even care about these places, look at what they've done to them, ignores the daily lived experience of people with this holy place, but that one that is central to the community there.
100%.
I'll just add to that, Dave. I think what you've touched on about what you've touched on in sort of the Zionist response online, and not just online. I mean, these videos, right, of Palestinian kids playing soccer outside in the mosque courtyard. And for people who aren't familiar with the way that the Al-Aqsa Mosque is structured, it's when we say a compound, it's a huge compound. You have the Dome of the Rock, and then you also have a number of other prayer halls, including the Qibli prayer hall, which is the larger mosque area that most of the prayers take place in. But there's a huge compound and courtyard, ancient courtyard around these buildings. And as you were mentioning, Dave, Palestinian life during Ramadan particularly, but also year round, happens in all places of, the compounds. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, when we say it's the third holiest site in Islam, I mean, it cannot be overstated how significant this place is, not just to Palestinians, but to Muslims around the world. I mean, this is where, as Mariam mentioned, this is where Al-Isra al-Mi'raj happened. This is where Muslims believe that the Prophet Mohammed, peace be upon him, ascended to heaven in a night journey. This is where Muslims believe that the Prophet prayed amongst 1,000 other prophets. And so it's and it's mentioned in the Quran several times, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I mean, before Muslims prayed in the direction of Mecca, they prayed in the direction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so this place is extremely significant to Palestinians and to Muslims everywhere. And it's an intrinsic part of Palestinian life in Jerusalem and, in general. Of course, as Mariam mentioned, because of the fragmentation that Palestinians have been subjected to over the years through borders and walls and checkpoints, Palestinians in other parts of the country, like in Gaza and the West Bank, have been restricted from accessing this site. And so that is why this site has become even more important to Palestinians of Jerusalem. I mean, it is the iconic quintessential landmark of Jerusalem, of Palestine. And also it is one of the last and final spaces for Palestinians in that city, and also just in general on the land that is still to some degree in the control, let's say. I mean, control maybe isn't the best word, but, in this sort of, under the hands of the Palestinian people still. It hasn't been sort of taken out, or it's not like the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron, which is also extremely religiously significant, but which has been split up into a synagogue and a mosque, which is heavily armed and manned inside and outside, with major checkpoints and metal gates and all of that. And Palestinian life in that religious space, for example, has been, almost totally obliterated. So the Al-Aqsa Mosque represents, it's not just a holy site for Palestinians and Muslims, but it represents a really important aspect of Palestinian life and Palestinian identity for Palestinians everywhere, but particularly for people in Jerusalem. And like you said, growing up at your synagogue, there was a playground, and, for different holidays, maybe kids would bring firecrackers or that sort of thing. And mosques in general, all over the world, not just in Palestine, not just Al-Aqsa, but mosques serve as these public spaces. I mean, Muslims, particularly during Ramadan, they don't just go to the mosque to pray. People gather at the mosque to pray, obviously, to worship. People spend the night throughout the night in the mosque. So when Israel and the media say, worship, people were barricading themselves inside the mosque, that's just a gross misunderstanding and misrepresentation of the Islamic faith, which is that it is common practice for worshipers to stay overnight in the mosque throughout the night for the last 10 days. It's also a place where people gather to eat. It's a place where people gather to play. I mean, and so it's not uncommon that mosques serve as these places where kids can run around and play and have a good time. People can eat, people can gather, people can foster community. They're not just places where you walk in, pray, and leave. And so when we see, Zionist attempts to sort of absolve Israel of the crimes that it committed on the holy site by somehow pointing its finger at Palestinians simply existing in their holy spaces and using them in the way that they're meant to be used. It's just, it's totally disingenuous. And unfortunately, the media also falls into this and then just regurgitates these talking points from the police and from Israeli officials, referring to Palestinians as agitators and barricading themselves inside the mosque. But if we just break it down and look at, okay, this is a holy site, this is a place of worship. People, sleeping in the mosque, playing soccer at the mosque, eating at the mosque, they're using that site in the way that it was intended to be used. The people who are
Exactly.
abusing the site are the ones who are coming in armed forces, firing rubber bullets and beating worshipers. Those are the ones who are perverting this site of worship. And so it's just so clear what's going on, when we see these sort of talking points. It's just a really gross attempt to deflect blame and reassign blame. And I'll just end with this, because in addition to the outrage at people playing football, we saw a lot of outrage about, oh, well, these kids, they're bringing fireworks into the mosque and that's disrespecting the holy site. Yeah, fireworks inside a mosque is not common practice. But if there weren't armed soldiers coming in on a regular basis, arresting and beating and shooting at worshipers, these kids wouldn't be bringing fireworks inside the mosque.
Yeah, and I completely agree with the Yumna, your outline of it all happening. And I think for our listeners, it's really important to recognize that this is part of colonial practice. Who are Israeli settlers to tell worshipers what respecting and disrespecting their space of worship should look like? And I think it falls into the larger paternalistic viewpoint of Israeli Zionist colonialism, in that Palestinians don't know what to do, that Palestinians are savages, that these Arabs live in a desert and we can make it blossom. So it's really repetitive of the same discourse that was said 70 years ago as they massacred Palestinians throughout the late 40s, well into today.
And I think Mariam just sort of hit the nail on the head, is that everything that we've seen sort of unfold over the past week at Al-Aqsa, in the West Bank, in Gaza, and the discourse surrounding it, of course, is a continuation of these colonial practices. I mean, when let's look at why is Israel going in and beating up worshipers and arresting people en masse and forcing Palestinians outside of this mosque. These aren't one-off occurrences. This is a common practice that is escalating every single year. It's getting worse and worse. This is part of the Zionist settler colonial state attempting to dispossess Palestinians from their land, from their spaces, and very clearly, take out one population to bring in another. Palestinians were getting shot at and beat up in the mosque and getting arrested and taken out and thrown out of their place of worship. Also, that Jewish groups and Jewish settlers could then come in and tour the compound in peace for Passover. So it's very clear the motivations behind it. It is not, as Israel says, because they were trying to enforce some obscure law about not allowing overnight worship at the mosque, or because, as the police said, they were quote unquote fearful about agitators, leading up to Passover. No, it's about restricting Palestinian access to their own spaces so that eventually these spaces can be handed over to the settlers. I mean, it's exactly what we saw happen over the years in places like Hebron, all over Palestine, and it's what we're seeing. It's what we're seeing in Sheikh Jarrah, in Silwan, in Beita, everywhere.
As we are talking about Palestinian access to their sites, let's not forget something important, that people in Gaza, Palestinian people in Gaza, cannot go in any way to do their prayers inside Al-Aqsa Mosque. I remember 20 years ago, my parents were going mostly every Friday at Al-Aqsa Mosque to do their prayers. But now Palestinians in Gaza are almost forget about Al-Aqsa Mosque. They don't go there. They don't have permits from Israeli side to go worship and do their prayers, especially in Friday. And that's it. The Palestinians inside Gaza cannot go to their place, to their mosque, their holy mosque in the holy month of Ramadan to just do their prayers inside Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Restricting access from Gaza, from the West Bank, from all across Palestine and even from outside of Palestine. I mean, there are millions of Palestinians living in exile outside of their homeland because Israel refuses to let them return to the place that they were kicked out of in 1948. So as Mariam said, it's just 75 years of these same practices happening in different formats. I want to transition a little bit to what we've seen sort of unfold after last week's events at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And, we've just spoken about how everything that we saw has been a continuation of, settler colonial practices. And I would say that since the attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque happened, we have, continued to see those practices play out in different areas. So we saw earlier this week on Monday, thousands of Israeli settlers marched through the Nablus area in the northern occupied West Bank in a show of support and calls for the rapid expansion and promotion of Israeli settlement construction and the legalization of illegal settler outposts. The march took place in the Nablus area, and it ended up at the illegal outpost of Eviatar. Now, this is something that our team has covered before. In 2021, the Eviatar outpost was established by far-right settler groups on Jabal al-Sabih. It's land that belongs to 3 villages in the Nablus area, primarily the village of Beta. In response to the erection of the outpost, we saw more than 2 months of nonstop protest from Palestinians in Beta. And the Palestinians in Beta paid a heavy price for protesting against this outpost. Since the outpost was erected and the protests began, at least 10 Palestinians have been killed from Beta and the surrounding villages. Thousands have been injured. Many of them, have suffered life-altering injuries. And so the march took place and it ended up at Eviatar. And the reason that it happened at Eviatar, it's not insignificant that the settlers chose that location just a few kilometers away, where the same settlers have been carrying out violent pogroms on the town of Hawara. And so the settler leaders stood up and said, we want Eviatar to be legalized, and we want to make all of this, ushering to all the land around them. We want to create many more Eviatars. We want all of this to be Eviatar. So it was a very bold call for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, kicking Palestinians out of their land, getting rid of Palestinians, and to replace them with Jewish settlements. Most notably, the march was attended by the high-ranking officials and ministers in the current Israeli government, who themselves are also hardline settlers. Among them was National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir of the Jewish Power Party, who we have covered extensively, and I'm sure our readers and listeners are very familiar with who he is and his practices. So this march, the fact that it happened after the attacks on Al-Aqsa, it happened in the wake of a Palestinian shooting operation that happened in the West Bank that killed 3 Israeli settlers in the Jordan Valley. And it happened sort of under the guise of settlers saying, we're not protected. And the way to combat this quote unquote wave of Palestinian terror is to promote settlement expansion. And we saw with the ministers, the presence of the ministers was essentially, giving the green light and stamp of approval to these settler groups. And so this was a very significant event that happened, and I believe it is going to have far-reaching consequences. And so I wanted to go to Mariam. Mariam, you have covered most recently in recent months a number of agreements that have taken place between Israel and the Palestinian Authority under different auspices, Jordan and Egypt and other regional states. And in some of these agreements, there were even agreements by the Israelis themselves to stop the creation of new settlements and stop promoting settlement expansion for a number of months. And we can see that is not the case. So I'm curious to hear from you what your assessment is of what we saw of the settler march that happened on Monday, what it sort of means for the current, the geopolitics in the region, these recent agreements, these security agreements that we've seen between Israel and the PA, and then, of course, what it means for Palestinians on the ground.
So what we've seen recently with the agreements with Israel is that during the Aqaba Sharm el-Sheikh summits in February and March, the agreement wasn't even to stop settlements. It was brought down to such a minimum that Israel was supposed to stop approving new settlements and not legalize outposts for just a period between 3 to 6 months. And they were still unable to commit to that, which kind of shows you what negotiations really mean. And it is a protraction of status quo without challenge or confrontation until the settler colonial project, is fulfilled. But in terms of the current escalation of settler demands and what we have seen in Nablus especially is an attempt to dominate over areas in the West Bank by force. Now, Ivitar was, as Yumna, you mentioned, it is an illegal outpost. It was delegitimized by the Israeli Supreme Court itself. But as we see, the Israeli government moving more towards a right-wing policy embedded institution, we also see that the settler movements are not the ones that are just carrying out this violence. They are leading the entire colonial project. And it shows you that it is these right-wing settler groups that call the shots in terms of what actually happens, that it is not really justice or legality. And I think the implications of that is a further emboldened settler group within the West Bank, at least, in terms of escalating violence to the point of, with the current standing impunity provided to Israeli settlers who are armed, as well as soldiers who are provided to them as reinforced protection, is that we're going to see a bloodbath, essentially. It is not a small number that since 2021, 635 Palestinians have been killed, and that is not seen as the horrendous crime that it is, will only mean that the numbers will continue to rise. And then it'll just be a sad memory within the history books. And I think that's where it seems to be headed, should it remain the same.
It's basically, last week, I think everyone was kind of holding their breath, measuring maybe the how far things were going to escalate based on if a war was going to happen in Gaza or not. And while so far, things there kind of ended with those Israeli airstrikes on Gaza, it doesn't mean that the situation is not developing. And it doesn't mean that, Israeli warfare on Palestinians is not increasing or taking shape elsewhere and in other forms. And I think that's really important for people to keep in mind.
As we wrap up today, I was hoping you all could share some moments of beauty that you've seen or experienced during this holy period of Ramadan and Easter and Passover. We've been talking about when we need to focus on the injustices that are ongoing in Palestine, but people live there and worship there, and this has been an interesting period of convergence of these three important holidays. And so I'm just wondering if you could leave us with some moments that have maybe stood out to you.
There is a lot of ugly that is being witnessed in Palestine, but there is also a lot of beautiful in the sense of community coming together. Now, Palestinians have zero protection services, neither from the Palestinian Authority, international community, or any other actor in that regards. So the coming together has really been a sight to witness, that I've seen people who aren't normally even religious or aren't committed to prayer, but they would join. They would go and they would do iftar within the Al-Aqsa compound, for example, and they would go through the humiliation on that checkpoint to ensure a grounding, to provide protection for one another, to ensure that the worship, at least, it remains a sanctity that is honored. And beyond that, just community coming together with innovative ways within giving medical services amid a dysfunctional medical sector in Palestine, or ensuring that families who are poor are receiving foods, or that those being detained are getting free legal representation. So it's these things that really kind of reinstill a semblance of hope and confrontation.
I agree with Mariam. Something that has been offering me, a little bit of hope, or has just been really nice to see, is the coming together of community and just the continuation of life beyond the violence, beyond the occupation, or rather in spite of it. It's funny, we see these very contradictory images coming out of Jerusalem at the same time. So I'm, big on TikTok. So I'll be on TikTok and I'll see videos, like the ones that we cover a lot, of Israeli forces raiding the compound and beating worshipers and that sort of thing. And that's still very much a reality. And then we'll also see videos of people walking through the old city. The lights are out. People are serving coffee to strangers. I watched a TikTok of these, I think there are these Muslim American girls that went to Jerusalem for Ramadan, and they visited Al-Aqsa, and they just met a Palestinian family there, and they had asked them for, what's a recommendation of a good kunafa place, a good place to have kunafa. And the family insisted that they go over to their home, and they made homemade kunafa for them, and they shared a meal together, and then they went to the mosque and they prayed together. And I think that's just so common in Palestine. You hear so many stories. I mean, I myself am not able to access the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but I've heard so many stories of people over the years, foreigners going to visit, people who are able to go visit during this month, and just experiencing so much love and so much community and so much beauty, and people, again, in spite of the violence, just living their lives and choosing to live another day and choosing to celebrate, the life that they have. And so it's just been really incredible to see.
Things that I'm seeing in Gaza here, that people adapted with airstrikes and wars, because the first day after these badly airstrikes that hit Gaza on Thursday last week, just in the morning, people go to streets and start their daily life as normal. I was going on the street and I asked someone about how they can do this, how they can just handle all the bombing at the night, and when the day starts, they go to their jobs and their daily life. And he answers me. He said that every day we live in Gaza is a war day, and if we want to stay home because of the war, we will die inside our homes and we will not go anywhere else. So this is painful, but also something about people's strength and power, that they deal with everything inside Gaza. Even when Israeli bombed there to ruin their holy month, they decided to ignore that Israeli airstrikes and go to the street and live their daily life as usual, without without allowing Israeli airstrikes to ruin them. So I think these challenging and people eyes inside Gaza streets, I'm not saying that they don't care about the war. No, of course they do, but they want to keep their life going as it is. They do not want the Israeli airstrikes to warn on them and ruin their month and their holy month of Ramadan. And of course, after that, we have the Holy Eid. So I think these are the most beautiful thing I've seen in my work inside Gaza.
That's our show. Thanks for listening. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication with no paywalls. If you would like to support our work, go to mondoweiss.net/donate. Please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find the show. And if you have any more feedback, send me an email at dave@mondoweiss.net. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode.